Hello, I am Jake Collins, and this is Knightmare Series 2, Episode 5, which was first broadcast on the 3rd of October 1988. This episode forms part of a particular memory for me, because uniquely, I didn't watch this in my own home on the 3rd of October 1988. I watched it in the house of a neighbour across the road. I'm pretty sure that Rosie was being taken to the doctor by my mum, and I wasn't going to be able to be in the house on my own. I was only 5 years old. As anyone who's read or listened to my ramblings about Knightmare at any point in the past knows, we had no video machine at this stage, so we couldn't set Knightmare to record. But it was such a special thing to me to sit down and watch Knightmare every week. I couldn't miss it. Clearly my granny across the road wasn't available. I couldn't watch it with her. She was off doing whatever 78-year-old ladies did for fun in those days. So my mum arranged for me to watch it at the house of this very kind neighbour who lived next door to my granny over the road. And some particular preparations were made. This neighbour shooed her own children out of the living room, or at least her son. The daughter must have been little more than a baby at the time, and there was a second daughter came along at some point, but she definitely wasn't around at this point. And I was left alone in the living room to watch Knightmare, and I was given something to eat. I expect my mum had provided it. And this very kind neighbour was even heard to say to her son at some point, "No, of course you can't go in the living room. Jake's watching Knightmare," or words to that effect, which I thought was a very admirable sentiment. So that's always been a particular memory for me, sitting there in the neighbour's house, watching Knightmare. A unique experience, and a memorable one. Of course, it's very typical of fate to try and stop me watching the first ever winner on Knightmare, which is what this episode contains. Mark and team winning their quest and becoming Knightmare's first ever champions. We're seeing them complete the very end of level 2 to start with here. That scene with the catacomb bite where they use Merlin's freezer spell to freeze the creature and pick up the letter, I think is rather indicative of how this quest seems to have challenges going on, but actually it's not much of a challenge at all. There's not much for the team to actually do. I always think watching that catacomb bite scene of Richard towards the end of Series 1, getting the pie from underneath the catacomb bite, and it's moving and growling the whole time. The letter there for Mark seems to be in a similar position, yet they have to freeze the catacomb bite to get it. I always think, well, they don't really need Merlin's magic for that. They can just sort of sneak in and back out again and pick it up like Richard did. I think this quest tries to present things as challenges that aren't really challenges, to try and force through that first winner, which already was attempted with the previous team, Chris and team, and of course, like Richard's team in Series 1, they screwed it up by taking the wrong object, leaving behind the very obviously correct object in the level 3 clue room. So now that that's happened twice, how are we combating it in this quest? Mark's team has no level 3 objects, so they can't possibly screw up the choice of which ones to take. What challenges is Mark facing here in level 3 instead? Cheering up the gargoyle, which is also reminiscent of Richard's quest, of course. But again, this is presented as a challenge for Mark and team that isn't really much of a challenge. And they've already done something very similar with Cedric in level 2. Cheering him up, as it were, making friends with him, making him feel good about himself and earning his help in that way, rather than answering riddles. Here Mark's doing pretty much the same thing, cheering up the gargoyle for an all-important spell that's vital for the quest. It seems like this team is completing challenges, but really they're not. They're just kind of walking through an extremely simple quest, which is all they can do under the circumstances, of course. It's not their fault. Poor old Mark does have a terrible time here with the gargoyle, and it's a very awkward scene. Mark struggles to think of things to say to it because he has to come up with a lot of things to say to it. It turns red, seems to have cheered up, and then starts turning blue again. So Mark has to resort to telling the gargoyle he loves it, which I'm sure must have been very awkward for him and is rather awkward to watch as well. Of course, this scene is really where the gargoyle reminds me of my mum. You just think you've started to cheer up the silly old thing, and it starts going, oh no, I'm just old and ugly, and you have to start all over again. I quite like the effect of, now where did I hide that door, and then it pops back in. Ah, there it is. But it'd be nicer to see that after they'd answered a gargoyle riddle, for example. If there was actually some element of challenge to this quest, I'd enjoy it much more. Mark is pretty charismatic as a dungeoneer. One of his advisors is charismatic, the other two aren't. Overall, it creates a slightly awkward viewing experience, I find, Mark's quest. But certainly it's much less awkward than the previous team, Chris's team. So I'm glad to see Mark's team as the first winners rather than them. Or indeed Richard's team, as I've said before. They create some very awkward viewing, and at least one of them creates some very bad gameplay. Fair enough with Merlin here, there's no challenge to get the spell as a reward for making progress deep into level 3. This is the last time, I suppose the second and last time, that we have the transparent or translucent effect here on Merlin's image in level 3. It'll always be a large, solid image after that. I think I prefer the solid image version. The fact that he's all large and powerful and imposing underlines the fact that this is an important level 3 moment. He doesn't need to be all see-through as well. Here we are again with something that appears to be a challenge but isn't really, and Mark's team isn't the only one that gets sneaking about with cavern whites for an apparent challenge that obviously there's no real danger to. Pick up this sprig of energy, sneak out. There's one cavern white right by the door. It's a pretty nice, tense level 3 scene, but looking at it in the cold light of day, it never stands a chance of bringing an end to the quest. Here's where I start thinking to myself, now Traegard, didn't you say that Cavern Whites had no sight, speech, or hearing in Series 1? And yet now, here in Series 2, we have to be dead quiet to sneak past them. It helps to make this apparent challenge, I suppose, if they had no sight, speech, or hearing and were asleep. You could get past them very easily, couldn't you, without waking them up? If you're not doing the specific challenge like Richard was in Series 1 of stopping them from smelling you out. Masking your scent with a stronger smell, the sniff bottle there. And Cavern Whites sniffing their prey out is kind of their USP, and it's only used that one time as an actual challenge, which I think is a bit of a shame. There's a scenario in one of the Knightmare books where you have to be carrying some meat to chuck into the corner to stop the Cavern Whites from eating you, which I think is quite a nice thing to put in a Knightmare quest. Choose your own adventure quest. And indeed, when I did first manage to re-watch all of Series 1, I was glad to see some form of it on the actual show with the sniff bottle. But in Series 2 and 3, Cavern Whites don't really present a real challenge like they did to Richard in Series 1. But they do provide some nice level 3 moments of atmosphere, and as I've said before, level 3 is really all about atmosphere rather than completing actual challenges. And in Mark's case, I do think that is particularly true. It takes them a long time here to decide to say no to Mogdred, doesn't it? Mogdred, of course, is a big aspect of level 3 atmosphere without any actual threat, and it's quite a tense scene. If we say no, he'll kill us and so on. But I think we can be sure when we're first watching that they're going to get through that scene okay. When I was first rewatching this episode back on video, I thought, when Traegard was saying, yet another decision team, and one you must take. I like how earlier in this series they haven't thought of Mogdred spell trapping Traegard as he does a couple of times later on. I don't really like that. I do think it interferes with Traegard's position and power as Dungeon Master. The fact that it adds some humour to the very haphazard scene of Neil's team and the Shroud spell is a benefit to the concept of Mogdred spell trapping Traegard, but it's kind of an accident that it works out so well with letter O. It's funny, but also very awkward. So on the whole, I prefer scenes like that one we just had, where Traegard is quite free to sit in the background and comment on what Mogdred's doing without being restrained by him in any way. The stained glass window room provides a nice bit of level 3 atmosphere every time we see it, including this time, and the sun spell showing the correct path. Nice level 3 moments, but of course easy, linear, not much of a challenge. I have a vague memory of first seeing this bit with the dragon, with the shadows all over most of the room, and thinking, that's a mouth, isn't it? Or a snout, a long mouth he's stepping onto. Certainly looks like one. And indeed, it turns out to be so. That's not the sort of memory I kept all those years when I didn't have any of Series 1 to 3 on video. But then, looking back at it, I get moments of familiarity, like, oh yes, I remember this scene. I have some vague recollection of some thoughts I was having during this scene, which is a big part of the fun of rediscovering Nightmare, coming across half memories like that would never have come back to the mind without a visual clue. This scene with the dragon is much better than Julian's scene with the dragon, and of course comparing Mark's level 3 and Julian's level 3 is something that can easily happen when talking about Knightmare, because they're the big expeditions deep into level 3 in this series, and of course they both end up winning. Julian doesn't have to do anything at all to escape. It's really lame. You can see why Mark tries here to flatter the dragon. He's already done it with Cedric and the gargoyle, so saying to the dragon, "I think you're beautiful," seems a very logical thing to do, but as one of the advisors points out, that won't work this time, Mark. Treguard has to say, use what weapons you have. It's obvious what to do, put it back to sleep with the sleep spell. It's an apparent challenge, it's not difficult, they're never gonna not get out of this room in one piece. But it's a striking, unusual setup with the dragon here. It's a nice level 3 scene. Level 3 really is all about that atmosphere and uniqueness. And we certainly have it here. The advisor in the middle makes the end of this scene very awkward, not wanting to use the other door to exit the room. He's got to come out here. What, the bottom of the screen are you talking about? As Treguard points out, hurry team, exit through the door. I mean, you'd think that would be obvious, wouldn't you? But, well, it was to the other two advisors, but not to old yellow jumper annoying idiot in the middle. Here we are at the final guillotine chamber, and when I watch the wins in series 2, I'm always reminded of Julian's interview in the Eye Shield fanzine. When I first read that, I hadn't re-watched on video either of the series 2 wins, Julian's own win or Mark's win. So I was interested to read Julian's comments on how he felt winning, and one of the things he said was, after all the positive, complimentary things he had to say about it, though it did turn out to be something of an anti-climax. And then when I finally saw this winning scenario back on video, I could see exactly what Julian meant, and I'll tell you precisely what I think of these series 2 winning scenes. They're pathetic. I hate them. I think they're awful. And that's not to say anything about the quality of the graphics or the animation of the bricks. Like everything else in Knightmare, it's groundbreaking and brilliant for the time. I just don't like it as a winning scenario. I do like the way you see Treguard outside the Great Hall for a bit here. Forced cheer there from the team, but I like the way Treguard says, others will no doubt follow in conquering the dungeon, but the glory of being the first to do so will always be yours. And that's true, isn't it? It's always nice to be the first to do something, to push back those boundaries. It's thanks to people who've done that others are inspired to do so in future, and humanity progresses in various ways over the years. The whole concept of freeing the maid is disappointing in Mark's quest. I remember first watching episode 4 back on video after the scene with Gretel, and Mark was leaving the kitchen. I'm thinking, well, come on then, Gretel, get kidnapped. Isn't Mogdred supposed to turn up and kidnap her? No, Igneous tells us, oh, that's happened off screen while you weren't looking. And then I thought, well, surely we'll see Gretel at the end of the quest when Mark frees her. But no, it's a picture of Gretel and her laugh in the background. I mean, it's bad enough when Julian redeems a picture of the talisman, but freeing Gretel by making this picture of her come up is particularly pathetic, in my opinion. I much prefer the unused scenario from Series 1 of Merlin turning up and saying, "Congratulations, you've mastered the dungeon," and then whisking you off in a blaze of glory and victory. That would be much more epic and exciting and appropriate for a thrilling win deep in level 3, I always think. Those Series 2 wins I do not like at all. And it seems very likely, from all available evidence, that winning Series 3 would have involved the same scenario with the guillotine and the bricks. I always wonder if they would have made some kind of effort to include Melisandre in person if Ross had won there rather than just having a picture of Melisandre on the spinning brick ball thing like they did with Gretel. Perhaps they wouldn't have bothered making that effort, but they did bother making more effort with Melly to include her plaintive cries to Ross throughout the quest. "Hurry, Ross, hurry, quick, and save me. Help me, Ross, help me." So it would have been particularly anticlimactic not to have seen her in person at the end of all that, wouldn't it? But that's one of those nightmare mysteries that we'll never know the answer to. I hope we would have seen Melly there, but there's something inside me that seriously doubts it. I was talking on my previous commentary about Olgarth not turning up after the second episode of Series 1. He's turning up now in the 5th episode of Series 2 to question Tony and team. They do have a certain charm about them. Tony and his 3 advisors from Ashford, Kent. They do remind me of certain boys I knew in my childhood. I do find them quite endearing and charming, and they have quite an interesting quest, which is only a very small part of here. But something I've only recently come to terms with about Tony and his level 1 objects here is they were supposed to take the fish, weren't they? It's a misleading clue from Olgarth earlier in the next episode. The fish is off today. Like Tony's advisors, I've always thought that means don't take the fish. And it reminds me of another misleading object clue that I'll almost inevitably remember to talk about in the final instalment of this series of 8 commentaries when we get there. But wouldn't it have been much neater if, in addition to the bat's wings for Mildred, Tony here had taken the fish, the off fish, the rotten fish, to cause a stomach upset in the 1 Series 2 appearance of the monster's stomach? That's what it was for, I'm quite sure now, and that's why you get the really odd, awkward situation of Gretel giving Tony the down spell as he's about to go down the well, and then he's in level 2, but he's not in level 2. He's gone down the well, but he hasn't made it to level 2 yet. He's in the monster's stomach instead, and they have to cast a spell they've only just got to get out of there. Surely they'd rather have gone up instead of down. It's a very awkward sequence, that, and provides ticklish questions about taking spells to different levels and still being on level 1 even though he's gone down the wellway and getting burped to level 2. Yeah, the monster's stomach was supposed to be on level 1 as usual, and they were supposed to use the rotten fish to make it burp. And that red advisor there actually works out the answer to the question about the kilted hordes. Of course, it's the Scottish, but they don't end up going for that as the answer. A kindred spirit for Karina in Series 4 there. And that's an end to this episode commentary. But do join me again next time, hot on the heels of talking about Nightmare Series 2, Episode 5. I'll be talking about Nightmare Series 3, Episode 5.